There's a moment in every war, one single moment, when everything changes. Not a campaign, not a strategy, not a general standing on a hill pointing at a map. A moment. Sometimes it lasts 4 minutes, sometimes 3 days. Sometimes it happens in a forest so dark that soldiers couldn't see the man dying next to them. And in those moments, the entire future of the United States of America hung by a single, terrifying thread. These are those moments. But here's what most history books will never tell you. The battles that decided America's fate were not won by superior numbers. They were not won by better weapons. They were won and lost by decisions made in the dark, by men who had no idea whether they would live to see the morning. And one of those decisions, you will not believe. Welcome. If you're watching this right now, it means you're someone who doesn't settle for the surface version of history, the version they give you in a classroom in 45 minutes and never bring up again. You want to know what was actually at stake? You want to feel it. You want to understand what it really meant when a nation's survival came down to a handful of exhausted, terrified, extraordinary human beings making a choice. This channel exists for exactly that reason. To tell the stories that history tried to compress into a single paragraph. The stories behind the stories. If that's you, and I think it is, then hit subscribe now, because what we're about to cover today is just the beginning. Every week, we go deeper into the moments that shaped the world you're living in right now. Now, let's go back. All the way back to a time when the United States of America did not exist yet. Think about what America was in 1775. Not what it became, what it was. A collection of colonies along the eastern edge of a continent. No professional army, no navy to speak of. No central treasury, no unified command. Just farmers, merchants, lawyers, and craftsmen who had decided, in what many people at the time called an act of absolute lunacy, that they were going to go to war against the most powerful empire on Earth. The British Empire. The same empire that had just spent decades and billions of pounds defeating France in the 7 Years' War. The same empire with the most disciplined army on the planet. The same empire with a navy so vast it controlled the seas. And these colonists, these farmers and blacksmiths, looked at all of that and said, "We will win." But here's what they didn't say out loud. What they couldn't afford to say out loud. They weren't sure. George Washington himself, the man, the legend, the face on the dollar bill, wrote letters to Congress in the early years of the Revolution that read less like the correspondence of a confident commander and more like the desperate pleas of a man watching his army dissolve in front of him. Men deserted. Supplies ran out. Soldiers fought in rags, in winter, barefoot, their feet leaving bloody footprints in the snow. France, which America desperately needed as an ally, was watching, waiting, not yet convinced that this rebellion was anything more than a romantic gesture about to be crushed. And then came a battle in upstate New York, a battle most Americans today couldn't find on a map, a battle that changed everything. And we need to talk about it, because without it, there is no United States of America. There is no Constitution. There is no Declaration of Independence hanging in a museum. There is no flag, no anthem, nothing. Without what happened at Saratoga in October of 1777, you and I are not having this conversation. It was, on paper, a brilliant plan. British General John Burgoyne, a man so confident in himself that his soldiers called him Gentleman Johnny, had designed a three-pronged assault to cut the American colonies in half. His force would march south from Canada through the Hudson Valley. A second force would push east from Lake Ontario. And a third army under General Howe would march north from New York City. They would converge. They would split the colonies along the Hudson River. New England, the heart of the rebellion, would be cut off, encircled, and strangled into submission. Elegant, logical, decisive. There was just one problem. General Howe decided not to show up. Instead of marching north to link up with Burgoyne, Howe pivoted south to capture Philadelphia, the political capital, the prestigious prize. He thought it would end the war faster. It wouldn't. And in doing so, he left Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne alone, with 6,000 men, deep in enemy territory, with supply lines stretching hundreds of miles through some of the most brutal wilderness in North America. On the American side, waiting for Burgoyne in the forests of upstate New York, was a man named Horatio Gates, cautious, political, careful, the kind of general who won by not losing. But the man who was actually going to have to fight Burgoyne, the man who would throw himself into the chaos of musket fire and bayonet charges and somehow survive, was someone else entirely. His name was Benedict Arnold. Yes, that Benedict Arnold, the man history remembers as America's greatest traitor, the name that became synonymous with betrayal. But in October of 1777, on the forested ridges above the Hudson River, Benedict Arnold was the greatest battlefield commander in the Continental Army. Aggressive, fearless, possessed by a kind of desperate battlefield genius that terrified his enemies and exhausted his allies. And he was about to save the American Revolution. September 19th, 1777. Burgoyne's army advanced through thick forest toward the American defensive position at Bemis Heights. The terrain was terrible for British-style warfare. They couldn't form their famous disciplined lines in those trees. Their artillery was nearly useless. Their advantage on open ground meant nothing here. The first engagement, at a clearing called Freeman's Farm, was brutal and inconclusive. The British held the field at the end of the day. Technically a British victory. But Burgoyne had lost 500 men he could not replace. His supply lines were getting thinner. And behind those trees, the Americans were getting reinforcements. Volunteers pouring in from across New England, many of them carrying their own rifles, motivated not by pay or conscription, but by pure, burning fury at a foreign army marching through their homes. Meanwhile, deep in the American camp, something ugly was happening. Gates and Arnold were fighting. Not the British, each other. Gates had written his battle report to Congress without mentioning Arnold's name. Not once. Arnold, who had fought with reckless courage at Freeman's Farm, who had arguably saved the position, was invisible in the official record. Gates wanted the credit. Arnold was furious, and with good reason. The two men barely spoke. Gates relieved Arnold of his command. And so, on October 7th, 1777, when the decisive second battle began, the Battle of Bemis Heights, Benedict Arnold was sitting in his tent, officially forbidden from commanding troops. The British attacked. Gates watched from behind the lines, cautious and methodical. The American forces were fighting well, but something was missing. There was no fire, no driving force, no one willing to look at the chaos and charge into it. And then Benedict Arnold heard the guns. He couldn't help it. He was a born fighter. The sound of battle was like a physical pull he couldn't resist. Arnold mounted his horse and rode out to the front lines. Gates sent an aide to stop him. The aide couldn't catch him. What followed was one of the most dramatic battlefield performances in American military history. Arnold rode along the lines, screaming at men to follow him, leading charge after charge, moving faster than bullets seemed able to find him. He rallied troops that were wavering. He seized the initiative at precisely the moments when the battle could have gone either way. He drove the British back into their fortified position, and then, in a moment of almost insane boldness, led his men through a gap in the British defenses. In a moment of almost insane boldness, led his men through a gap in the British defenses. He was shot in the leg, the same leg that had been wounded at Quebec. His horse was killed underneath him. It didn't matter. The British position had been breached. Burgoyne's forces were shattered. And 10 days later, on October 17th, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered. 5,795 British soldiers laid down their arms. And in the courts of France, King Louis XVI sat up and paid attention. Within months, France officially entered the war on the side of the Americans. The loans, the naval support, the troops, everything America needed to finally, eventually, win. The American Revolution survived because of what happened at Saratoga. Period. And the man most responsible for winning it, the man whose reckless courage literally turned the battle, would 4 years later defect to the British. But that is a story for another day. Because now we have to jump forward 86 years to a Pennsylvania town most people had never heard of, to 3 days in the summer of 1863 that would tear the American army apart and put it back together in a form that would determine the future of democracy itself. There is something uniquely devastating about the American Civil War that sets it apart from every other conflict in this story. At Saratoga, Americans fought British soldiers, a foreign power, an occupying force, an enemy from across the ocean. At Midway and the Bulge, Americans would fight the armies of empires that had declared themselves enemies of freedom. But Gettysburg? At Gettysburg, American soldiers killed other American soldiers. Men who spoke the same language, who grew up reading the same books, who prayed to the same God, whose grandfathers had, in some cases, fought side by side in the Revolution. For 3 days in early July of 1863, the rolling fields and rocky ridges outside a small Pennsylvania crossroads town became the bloodiest ground in American history. Over 51,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in 72 hours. And what was decided in those 72 hours was nothing less than this. Would the United States of America continue to exist? And if it did, what kind of nation would it be? By the summer of 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee was the most respected military commander in North America, possibly the world. His Army of Northern Virginia had handed the Union Army defeat after humiliating defeat. Second Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, where he outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outfought a Union force twice his size. But Lee had a problem. The Confederacy was running out of everything: food, ammunition, men. The longer the war went on, the more the industrial North's advantages would grind down the South's armies through sheer weight of material. Lee needed a decisive victory. Not in Virginia, not in the South, in the North, on Union soil. He needed to march into Pennsylvania, into the heart of the Union, and win a battle so overwhelming, so complete, that the Northern public would demand an end to the war, that European powers would finally recognize the Confederacy, that President Lincoln would be forced to negotiate. He took his 75,000 men and marched north. It was the greatest gamble of his life.
July 1st, 1863. The battle didn't begin as a battle. It began as a collision. Confederate infantry searching Gettysburg for shoes stumbled into Union cavalry. What started as a skirmish exploded into a full engagement as both sides rushed reinforcements to the sound of the guns. By the end of the first day, the Union forces had been pushed back through the town and onto Cemetery Hill, the high ground south of Gettysburg. They'd been beaten, badly. Over 9,000 Union soldiers were casualties. But they held the high ground. And in warfare, high ground is everything.
July 2nd began with a catastrophic decision. Union General Daniel Sickles, a controversial, politically connected general who had once literally gotten away with murder in a sensational Washington, D.C. trial, decided to move his corps forward from the ordered defensive line without permission. He advanced into a peach orchard that he thought offered better ground. It didn't. It offered an exposed salient that Confederate General James Longstreet's corps hit with everything it had. The peach orchard became a slaughterhouse. The wheat field changed hands 6 times in 2 hours. The Devil's Den, a boulder-strewn gorge at the base of a rocky hill called Little Round Top, echoed with the screams of men fighting hand to hand. And on Little Round Top itself, barely garrisoned, almost undefended, a Union colonel named Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was about to face an impossible situation. Chamberlain was not a professional soldier. He was a professor of rhetoric at Bowdoin College in Maine, who had taught himself military tactics from books while on sabbatical. He had no formal military training. He had been in the Army for less than 2 years. But he was smart, calm under fire, and possessed of an absolute, almost serene belief that what he was doing mattered. His regiment, the 20th Maine, held the extreme left flank of the entire Union line on Little Round Top. If the Confederates got around him, if they flanked his position, they would roll up the entire Union line from behind. The battle would be over. Lee might win the war. The Alabama regiments attacking him were brave, disciplined, and relentless. They came up that rocky slope again and again. Chamberlain's men fought back, loaded and fired, loaded and fired. Men fell beside him. His ammunition ran low. Then it ran out. The Alabamians were forming for another charge. This time, there would be nothing to stop them. Chamberlain looked at his men. He looked at the slope below him. He looked at the enemy forming in the trees. And he made a decision that, in retrospect, reads like something from a novel. Fix bayonets. His men stared at him. Bayonets? Against men with loaded rifles attacking uphill? Charge! The 20th Maine swept down the hill in a wheeling movement, the left side swinging forward like a door, slamming into the Confederate attack with cold steel and screaming voices. The shock and surprise of it, the sheer audacity, stopped the attack cold. Dozens of Confederates were captured. The rest retreated. Little Round Top held. The Union line held. And on July 3rd, Robert E. Lee made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Lee had hit the Union left on day 2. He would hit the Union right on day 3. But first, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 163 Confederate cannons opened fire on the Union center at Cemetery Ridge. It was the largest artillery barrage in the history of the Western Hemisphere. For 2 hours, the ground shook. Horses screamed. The smoke was so thick, men choked on it. And then the barrage stopped.
And from the tree line across a mile of open ground, 12,000 Confederate soldiers stepped out and began to walk toward the Union lines. Pickett's Charge, a name that still carries the weight of everything it cost. The Union artillery, which had mostly survived the Confederate barrage by pulling back, opened up. Shells tore through the advancing Confederate lines. Then the Union infantry on the ridge opened with rifles. The Confederate soldiers fell in hundreds, in waves, in terrible, heartbreaking numbers. Some of them reached the stone wall at the crest of Cemetery Ridge. There was brutal, savage fighting at what history calls the high water mark of the Confederacy. And then they broke. They fell back across that mile of open ground, leaving behind half their number. Lee rode out to meet them, telling them the defeat was his fault, his plan, his failure. He was right. Gettysburg cost Lee 28,000 men, nearly a third of his army, in 3 days. He would never again launch a major offensive operation. The Confederacy would fight on for nearly 2 more years, but Gettysburg was the beginning of the end. 4 months later, Abraham Lincoln stood on the hillside above the battlefield, where the dead were being buried, and said something that nobody in the crowd thought was particularly remarkable. It was 272 words. It took 2 minutes to deliver. It would echo forever. But here is where this story gets strange. Here is where we have to talk about something that rewrites how most people understand these battles. Because most people think decisive battles are about strategy, about tactics, about firepower and numbers. They're not. Stay with me, because we're about to flip everything you think you know. Every battle we've talked about, everyone we're about to talk about. Saratoga, Gettysburg. What's coming next? Midway, the Bulge. The history books give you the generals' names, the dates, the casualty figures, the decisive factors. But the decisive factor was never the plan. The decisive factor was always the same thing. In 1777, in 1863, in 1942, in 1944, always, without exception. It was a single human being, in a moment of complete chaos, complete terror, complete uncertainty about whether the next second would be their last, choosing to act. Arnold on his horse, Chamberlain on that hillside, the young American pilots you're about to hear about, the soldiers in the snow you're about to meet. None of them knew they were making history. None of them knew the outcome. They just moved. They acted. They decided. And I want you to sit with a question for the rest of this video. What would you have done? Because it's easy to hear these stories from a distance of centuries and think, of course they did what they did. It was the right thing. It was obvious. But it wasn't obvious. Nothing was obvious. Everything was fog and fire and noise and pain. And that is why what comes next, the summer of 1942, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, is one of the most extraordinary stories I have ever encountered. Because the men who decided the outcome of that battle, they had 4 minutes. 4 minutes. 6 months. That's how long it had been since the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, when 353 aircraft swept out of the morning sky and sank or damaged 18 American ships, killed nearly 2,500 Americans, and pushed the United States into the Second World War. In those 6 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had moved across the Pacific like a tidal wave. Wake Island, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma. They had swept aside British, Dutch, and American forces and built an empire stretching from the Aleutian Islands to Burma, from the Central Pacific to the borders of India. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the most respected naval strategist in the Japanese Navy, knew this could not last. He knew America's industrial capacity meant that time was against Japan. Every month the war continued, America would grow stronger. Japan had one option: force a decisive naval battle, destroy the American Pacific Fleet completely, and force a negotiated peace before American war production could overwhelm Japan. The target was Midway, a small atoll in the Central Pacific, but strategically vital as an American airbase. Yamamoto would attack Midway, force the Americans to respond with their remaining carriers, and then annihilate them. He had 4 fleet carriers, 3 light carriers, 11 battleships, and over 200 supporting vessels. He had the most powerful naval force in the history of the Pacific Ocean. The Americans had 3 carriers. One of them, the Yorktown, had been so badly damaged at the Coral Sea that Japanese intelligence reported it sunk. Yamamoto was confident. He should not have been, because the Americans had a secret weapon. Not a bomb, not a new aircraft, not a superior admiral. They had Joseph Rochefort, a naval intelligence officer working in a basement in Pearl Harbor, known as the Dungeon, because it was, quite literally, a windowless basement, who had spent months painstakingly breaking the Japanese naval code. By May of 1942, Rochefort and his team had cracked enough of the Japanese codes to know that Yamamoto was planning a major operation at a target designated AF. They believed AF was Midway. Their superiors were not convinced. So Rochefort did something brilliantly simple. He had Midway broadcast a fake message, in the clear, unencrypted, reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, Japanese intelligence reported to their commanders that AF is short of water. Confirmation. The target was Midway. American Admiral Chester Nimitz knew where the attack was coming. He knew roughly when. He positioned his 3 carriers in ambush north of Midway, where Japanese reconnaissance would not find them. When Yamamoto's fleet appeared, expecting an ambush, they walked into one. June 4th, 1942. The morning had not gone well for the Americans. Wave after wave of torpedo bombers had attacked the Japanese carriers and been shot down in catastrophic numbers. 41 torpedo bombers attacked. 35 were shot down. The Japanese carriers remained untouched, their combat air patrol of Zero fighters flying low after chasing down the torpedo bombers. The Japanese decks were chaos. Aircraft being rearmed, bombs being switched back out for torpedoes, fuel lines snaking across the deck. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were loaded with armed aircraft, aviation fuel, and ammunition. And then, at approximately 10:22 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey looked down from 30,000 feet through a gap in the clouds and saw the Japanese fleet below him. McCluskey commanded the dive bombers from the Enterprise. For hours, he had been searching for the Japanese fleet. His planes were almost out of fuel. He had nearly given the order to turn back. He had made the decision to keep searching for just a few more minutes, following a lone Japanese destroyer he spotted below. That decision, to keep going for just a few more minutes, led him here, to this moment. He pushed over into his dive. The Enterprise dive bombers plunged toward the Akagi and Kaga. At the same moment, dive bombers from the Yorktown found the Soryu. The Japanese fighters were too low to intercept. The anti-aircraft gunners were too slow. In 4 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were turned into burning wrecks. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu. 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Burning. Sinking.
carrying their aircraft and their crews and their dreams of Pacific Empire to the bottom of the ocean. A fourth carrier, the Hiryu, counterattacked and put the Yorktown out of action before being sunk that afternoon. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway. They would never be replaced. They lost over 300 aircraft. They lost their most experienced, irreplaceable naval aviators, pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had fought in China, who had spent years mastering their craft. They lost everything. Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. America would still fight for 3 more brutal years. But after Midway, Japan was always on the defensive, always bleeding, always falling back. Because of a broken code, because of a fake message about water, because McCluskey decided to keep searching for just a few more minutes. 4 minutes. The entire course of the war in the Pacific changed in 4 minutes. But the war in Europe was still raging, and in December of 1944, in a frozen forest in Belgium, the German Wehrmacht would make one final, desperate attempt to change the outcome of the Second World War. By December of 1944, the war in Europe should have been over. Allied forces had liberated France. They had pushed through Belgium. They were approaching the German border. In the east, Soviet forces were grinding through Poland toward Germany itself. But the Nazi regime refused to collapse. And Adolf Hitler, increasingly isolated, physically deteriorating, but still capable of a terrifying strategic instinct at moments, had a plan. He would strike through the Ardennes, the same dense, hilly, heavily forested region of Belgium and Luxembourg that German forces had torn through in 1940 to bypass the Maginot Line and conquer France in 6 weeks. The Allies had thinned their lines there, believing the terrain too difficult for a major offensive. Hitler would smash through, drive to Antwerp, the Allies' main supply port, cut the Allied armies in half, capture fuel depots desperately needed by German armor, and with the Allied front shattered and Antwerp in German hands, force a negotiated peace in the West before turning to face the Soviets. It was fantasy. His generals knew it. Almost every professional military officer in the Wehrmacht knew it. They didn't have the fuel. They didn't have the men. They didn't have the aircraft to protect the advance from Allied air power. But Hitler had one card to play that nobody could predict. The weather. December 16th, 1944. Before dawn. Temperatures below freezing. A heavy overcast that grounded Allied aircraft completely. 200,000 German soldiers and over 600 tanks erupted from the Ardennes with a massive artillery barrage. The American lines in that sector were thinly held, mostly by exhausted units pulled back to rest, or green troops seeing their first combat. They were overwhelmed, surrounded, or simply swept aside. By December 20th, German forces had torn an enormous bulge in the Allied line, hence the battle's name. In the center of the bulge, the town of Bastogne stood at the intersection of 7 major roads. Control Bastogne, control the roads, and German forces needed those roads. Defending Bastogne was the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, plus elements of armored and infantry units. They were surrounded. They were outnumbered. They were running low on everything: ammunition, food, medical supplies. The wounded lay in makeshift hospitals in barns and basements. Frostbite was taking men faster than German bullets. On December 22nd, a German commander sent a formal surrender demand to the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. McAuliffe read the demand. He thought for a moment, and then he wrote a one-word reply. nuts. The German officers, when presented with this reply, asked the American officer who delivered it what it meant. The American officer smiled and said, in plain English, it means the same as go to hell. And the 101st Airborne held Bastogne. The Germans threw everything they had at the surrounded Americans. Tanks, artillery, infantry, assault after assault through the snow and ice. And the screaming eagles fought back. Every time. The weather, which had protected the German advance, changed on December 23rd. The clouds broke, and within hours, Allied aircraft filled the skies, dropping supplies to the defenders of Bastogne and hammering German columns with everything they had. 3 days later, on December 26th, elements of General George Patton's Third Army, which had achieved a logistical miracle by turning an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter to drive north toward Bastogne, broke through the German encirclement. The bulge was slowly, painfully pushed back. By late January of 1945, the German lines had been restored to roughly where they had been in December. But the human cost to Germany was catastrophic and irreplaceable. Over 100,000 German casualties, 800 tanks, the last operational reserve of the Wehrmacht on the Western Front, destroyed. Germany would surrender less than 4 months later. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest land battle ever fought by American forces. Over 600,000 American soldiers participated. 80,000 were casualties. And it was won, in the end, by soldiers standing in the snow in a surrounded Belgian town, running out of everything and refusing to stop. Think about what we have covered. A wounded man on horseback charging into cannon fire because he couldn't help himself. A college professor ordering his men to charge downhill with empty rifles. A naval officer deciding to keep searching for just a few more minutes of precious fuel. A surrounded general writing one word on a piece of paper. None of these men had a guarantee. None of them knew what the history books would say. None of them knew that the decision they were making in that moment of fog and fear and absolute uncertainty would echo forward through decades and centuries. They just decided. And I want you to really feel the weight of that for a moment. Because the country you live in, the freedoms you have, the fact that this video can exist, that you can watch it on a device in your pocket, that you can say what you think and worship how you choose and be whatever you choose to be. All of it traces back in some unbroken line through time, through blood, through sacrifice, to a handful of terrible, beautiful, terrifying moments when someone chose not to stop. When Benedict Arnold, flawed, prideful, and 2 years away from his betrayal, heard the guns and could not stay in his tent. When Joshua Chamberlain looked at his empty rifles and thought, the only option left is to go forward. When Wade McCluskey looked at his fuel gauge and kept searching. When Anthony McAuliffe read a surrender demand and laughed. These were not supermen. They were not invincible. They were not certain. They were scared and cold and tired and in pain, and they had every reason to stop. They didn't stop. That is the story of America. That is the story of these battles. Not the tactics, not the strategies. The people. Always the people. You can visit these places today. You can stand on the ridge at Little Round Top and look down the same slope that the 20th Maine ran down with their bayonets. The rocks are still there. The trees have grown back. It's quiet now. Almost impossibly quiet. You can walk the ground at Saratoga, where Burgoyne's army was surrounded and defeated, and the fate of the American Revolution was decided. They maintain a walking tour. There are plaques. There are always plaques. But no plaque can give you the weight of it. The smell of the air, the sound of the wind in the trees, the knowledge that on this exact piece of ground, at a moment of absolute crisis, someone decided. The deeper lesson, the one that I keep coming back to every time I study these battles, is not military. It's not strategic. It's human. Every generation faces its own version of the Ardennes, its own little round top, its own moment when the easy thing to do is to retreat, to surrender, to write back and say we can't hold. The question history is always asking, the question that never changes, from 1777 to 1863 to 1942 to 1944 and beyond, to every crisis every generation faces, is simple. What will you do? Not what did they do, not what should someone have done. What will you do? When the stakes are real, when the outcome is uncertain, when there is every reason to stop and almost no guarantee that going forward will work, will you keep searching for just a few more minutes? Will you fix bayonets? Will you write nuts on a piece of paper and go back to defending your position? I believe you will. I believe most people will, if they understand what's at stake, if they understand the weight of the moment they're in. That's why stories like these matter. Not as nostalgia, not as nationalism, as mirrors. So that when your moment comes, whatever shape it takes, you'll recognize it, and you'll know what to do. We started this video with a question. We said there is a moment in every war, one single moment, when everything changes. And we said that moment is decided not by weapons or numbers or strategy, but by a human being choosing to act. I hope that landed the way it was meant to. Because if you've made it this far, you already know that this isn't really a channel about battles. It's a channel about choices, about the moments when the weight of history pressed down on ordinary people, soldiers, commanders, cryptanalysts in basements, and they chose to carry it. If those stories move you, if they remind you that history is not a collection of facts, but a collection of decisions made by human beings no different from you, then this is your channel. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, because every week we go deeper. Because the story we haven't told yet, the one that might be the most unbelievable of all these battles, is the story of what happened at Chosin Reservoir in North Korea in December of 1950. 15,000 American and Allied Marines, surrounded by over 100,000 Chinese soldiers, minus 30-degree temperatures, no air support, no relief column coming. And what the Marine commander said when he was told he was surrounded is even better than nuts. That story is coming. I'll see you there.